The restaurant buzzed with the hum of conversation, the soft clinking of silverware against fine china blending into the ambient jazz music playing in the background. Emily Carter stood near the entrance, shifting uncomfortably in her black dress, the only elegant outfit she owned, reserved for rare occasions. Tonight was one of those nights. Her best friend, Sophie, had invited her to this upscale restaurant for a much-needed catch-up. But as expected, Sophie was running late. After checking her phone for the 10th time, Emily sighed and approached the host. "Reservation for Sophie Taylor," she said, glancing around nervously. The host nodded without question and gestured for her to follow. The restaurant was dimly lit, the golden glow of chandeliers reflecting off the polished marble floors. As they weaved through the tables, Emily felt out of place among the well-dressed patrons, sipping expensive wine and laughing effortlessly. The host pulled out a chair by a table near the grand window, and she quickly sat down, relieved to finally have a seat. She reached for the menu and nearly choked when she saw the prices. $48 for a salad? She let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. Sophie definitely owed her for this. She picked up the glass of wine that had already been poured at the table, assuming it was a welcome gesture from the restaurant. Just as she took a sip, a deep, smooth voice interrupted her thoughts. "I'm guessing you have a very good reason for sitting at my table." Emily froze mid-sip, her pulse quickening. She slowly looked up and locked eyes with a man sitting across from her, his gaze sharp, amused, and utterly unreadable. He was impeccably dressed in a dark navy suit, his golden brown hair slightly tousled in a way that seemed both effortless and deliberate. His presence was overwhelming, his expression unreadable, as if he was more intrigued than offended by the situation. She swallowed hard, her mind scrambling for an explanation. Instead of reacting with annoyance, the man leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together, studying her with a patient curiosity. "You look surprised." "But I should be the one surprised. People don't usually sit here uninvited." Before Emily could respond, a waiter suddenly appeared, turning his full attention to the man across from her. "Mr. Blackwood, your usual order will be ready shortly. Would you like any modifications tonight?" Emily's stomach dropped. Blackwood, as in Jack Blackwood, the billionaire, the media mogul, the man whose name was synonymous with power and secrecy? She felt her breath hitch as the realization hit her like a freight train. She hadn't just sat at the wrong table. She had unknowingly intruded on the dinner of one of the most influential men in the country. And now he was staring at her with a look that suggested he wasn't going to let her leave so easily. Emily's mind raced, every fiber of her being screamed at her to apologize, stand up, and leave immediately. But her body betrayed her. She remained frozen, gripping the stem of the wine glass as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. Across the table, Jack Blackwood observed her with an air of detached amusement, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the tablecloth. "So?" he prompted, arching an eyebrow. "Are you going to explain why you're sitting at my table?" Emily swallowed hard. Think. Saying, "I sat here by mistake," felt embarrassingly inadequate. Saying nothing wasn't an option either. Finally, she exhaled sharply and forced an awkward smile. "Would you believe me if I said fate put me here?" To her surprise, Jack let out a soft chuckle. Not forced, not mocking, genuine. "Fate, huh? That's a new one." Just then, the waiter returned with a bottle of vintage wine and poured Jack a glass. Emily's heart pounded as she realized the mistake had gone too far. "Wait, this is all a misunderstanding." Jack raised a hand, silencing her with an effortless authority that made her throat dry. "Let's say I believe you." He took a slow sip of his wine, studying her over the rim of the glass. "But here's the thing, Miss Carter. Emily Carter. Miss Carter." He leaned forward slightly. "You sat at my table. You drank my wine. By social contract, that means you owe me a dinner conversation." Emily blinked. Was he serious? I don't think that's how social contracts work, asterisk. Jack's lips curled into a smirk. "Maybe not, but I don't often get unexpected company, and you intrigue me." Emily's fingers tightened around her napkin. She knew she should get up and leave, but something about the way he looked at her, like she was an unsolved puzzle, made it impossible to move. "So what do you say, Miss Carter?" Jack tilted his head. "Will you stay?" The smart thing would be to leave. The right thing would be to leave. But against all logic, Emily found herself nodding. "I guess one dinner conversation won't hurt." Jack Blackwood smiled. And just like that, the game had begun. Emily still wasn't sure how it had happened. One minute, she had been planning her escape, and the next, she was agreeing to have dinner with Jack Blackwood. She told herself it was out of politeness. After all, she had technically stolen his table. But deep down, she knew the truth. There was something about him, his presence, his confidence, the way he studied her like a mystery he intended to solve. And, against all reason, she wanted to know what he was hiding too. The waiter returned, presenting 2 elegantly plated dishes. Emily hadn't even ordered, yet somehow, the meal placed in front of her looked incredible. She glanced at Jack, who simply sipped his wine, as if he had orchestrated everything effortlessly. "You didn't even ask what I wanted." "You look like a woman who appreciates good pasta," he replied casually, twirling his fork into his own dish. Emily narrowed her eyes. "And what if I was allergic?" Jack smiled, not missing a beat. "Then I suppose I'd owe you an apology and an EpiPen." Despite herself, Emily laughed. She hated how easy it was to fall into conversation with him, how quickly he disarmed her with his wit. "So, Jack Blackwood," she said, spearing a piece of ravioli. "What's a man like you doing having dinner alone in a restaurant like this?" Jack considered her for a moment, as if deciding how much he wanted to reveal. "Maybe I enjoy my own company, or maybe no one else can keep up with you." Something flickered in his expression, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. Emily had hit a nerve, but she couldn't tell if it was a good or bad thing. "You're observant," he murmured, setting his glass down. "Most people don't notice that. Most people are probably too intimidated to ask." Jack smirked, as if she had just passed some kind of unspoken test. "And you're not intimidated, Miss Carter?" Emily met his gaze head-on. "Should I be?" For the first time that evening, Jack hesitated. Not long enough for an ordinary person to notice, but Emily wasn't ordinary. And in that fleeting second, she saw something else beneath his carefully curated exterior. Something guarded. Something dangerous. Then, just as quickly, his smirk returned, smooth and effortless. "Let's just say," he murmured, leaning slightly closer, "curiosity can be a dangerous thing." The words sent a shiver down Emily's spine, but she wasn't sure if it was fear or excitement. And for the first time that night, she wondered if sitting at the wrong table had been a mistake after all. Emily wasn't sure if it was the wine, the atmosphere, or the way Jack Blackwood looked at her like she was the only person in the room, but she was starting to forget that she had no business being here. She had heard his name before, of course. Jack Blackwood, a billionaire with a reputation as elusive as it was intimidating. He rarely appeared in interviews, never indulged in public scandals, and yet, his name carried weight in every business and media circle in the country. People speculated about him endlessly, how he built his empire, how he remained untouchable. Some even whispered about the darker rumors, the kind that were never confirmed, but never fully denied either. And yet, sitting across from him, Emily found it hard to reconcile the legend with the man in front of her. He wasn't cold or distant like she had imagined. He was sharp, witty, and disturbingly good at making her feel at ease, which she suspected was exactly why he was so dangerous. She swirled the last of her wine in her glass. "So, Mr. Blackwood, is this what you do? Spend your evenings dining alone and waiting for strangers to accidentally sit at your table?" Jack smirked. "I could ask you the same thing. Do you make a habit of stealing dinners from mysterious men?" "Only when my friend is running late." She exhaled, shaking her head. "I swear, Sophie is going to owe me for this one." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Sophie? My best friend. She was the one who invited me here. She made the reservation, but as usual, she's late. I thought the host was leading me to our table, but clearly..." She gestured vaguely between them. Jack hummed in amusement. Then I suppose I should thank her. If she had been on time, I wouldn't have had the pleasure of your company tonight. Emily rolled her eyes. Smooth. Honest, he corrected, setting his glass down. It's not often that someone surprises me, Miss Carter. You did. There was something unsettlingly sincere about the way he said it. Emily felt a flicker of unease, but it wasn't fear. It was something far more dangerous. A spark of curiosity. You keep calling me Miss Carter, she noted, tilting her head. But you already know my first name. Why not just call me Emily? Jack leaned back in his chair, watching her with an intensity that made the air feel heavier. Because Emily, he said slowly, deliberately, first names imply familiarity. And I don't think you're ready for that just yet. A shiver ran down her spine, but she refused to look away. And what makes you so sure of that? Jack's lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. Because you're still trying to convince yourself that you don't want to know more about me. Emily opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. Because deep down, she knew he was right. And that realization was more dangerous than anything Jack Blackwood could ever say. Emily should have walked away. She should have laughed off the entire situation, thanked Jack for his hospitality, and left before she got tangled in whatever this was. But something about him, about the way he spoke, the way he watched her like he was waiting for her to crack, kept her in her seat. She wasn't naive. Jack Blackwood wasn't just some charming stranger. He was a man used to control, to calculated risks. And yet, for some reason, he was letting this moment unfold naturally, as if he was just as curious about her as she was about him. You still haven't answered my question, Emily said finally, pushing her empty plate aside. Jack raised a brow. Which one? Why were you having dinner alone? He studied her for a moment before responding. Not everyone enjoys an audience, Miss Carter. A man like you? I find that hard to believe. Jack exhaled a quiet chuckle, as if she had said something amusing. He swirled the last of his wine in his glass before speaking again. Tell me, Emily. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping just enough to send a shiver down her spine. Do you ever feel like you don't belong? Emily blinked, caught off guard. What kind of question was that? She hesitated. Why would you ask me that? Jack tilted his head, observing her reaction. Because I think you do. Right now, sitting here, with me. Her breath hitched. He wasn't wrong. Ever since she sat down at this table, she had been hyper-aware of the difference between them. His world wasn't her world. It never would be. And yet, he was looking at her like none of that mattered. Maybe I do, she admitted. But that doesn't explain why you're alone. Jack considered her for a moment, as if weighing how much to tell her. Then, he placed his glass down and laced his fingers together. What if I told you I was waiting for someone? Emily frowned. Someone specific? Not at first. His lips twitched. But then a woman sat at my table by mistake, and I decided to see where the evening would take me. Her pulse quickened. Was he saying what she thought he was saying? You mean me? Jack didn't deny it. You intrigue me, Emily. His voice was smooth, deliberate. And I don't find many things intriguing these days. She swallowed, suddenly feeling like she was standing on the edge of something she didn't fully understand. So what happens now? She asked. Jack smiled. That depends on you. Her fingers curled against the table. She didn't know what he was offering. An adventure. A mistake. A game she wasn't sure she knew how to play. But for some reason, she couldn't bring herself to walk away. Emily had no illusions about who Jack Blackwood was. He was the kind of man who never did anything without a reason. Every move, every word calculated. And yet, here he was offering her a choice. A chance to step into his world, if only for a moment. And for reasons she couldn't quite explain, she was tempted. Depends on me? She repeated, crossing her arms. That's a little vague, don't you think? Jack smirked, as if he had expected her to push back. Let me be clearer then. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping just enough to make her pulse quicken. Spend the rest of the evening with me. Emily's breath caught in her throat. What? You heard me. Jack's expression was unreadable, but there was something in his gaze, something darkly intriguing that sent a shiver down her spine. "Let's see where the night takes us." Emily hesitated. She should say no. She should get up and leave before she got pulled into something she didn't understand. But the problem was, she wanted to understand. She wanted to know why a man like Jack Blackwood was sitting alone in a restaurant, why he seemed so interested in her of all people. She exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself. And what exactly would that entail? Jack didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch between them. His blue eyes locked onto hers, studying her reaction. Then he finally spoke. "A drive." Emily blinked. "A drive?" "Yes." He set his glass down, his fingers drumming lightly against the table. "No obligations, no expectations. Just a drive. If at any point you want me to take you home, I will." There was something almost disarming about how casually he said it, as if this were the most normal suggestion in the world. But nothing about Jack Blackwood was normal. Emily bit her lip, her mind warring with itself. This was reckless. This was a terrible idea. "Okay," she said before she could stop herself. Jack's lips curled into a slow, satisfied smile. "Good choice, Miss Carter." Before she could second-guess herself, Jack signaled to the waiter. Within seconds, the check was handled, no bill, no exchange of credit cards. Just a nod from the staff, as if they already knew better than to question him. Jack stood and extended a hand toward her. "Shall we?" Emily stared at his outstretched hand for a moment, knowing that if she took it, there would be no turning back. But then again, maybe she didn't want to turn back. Slowly, she placed her hand in his, and just like that, the night truly began. The night air was crisp against Emily's skin as she stepped outside, her fingers still tingling from the warmth of Jack's brief touch. The city stretched before them, lights flickering like stars scattered across the skyline. For a moment, she hesitated, glancing up at the man beside her. Jack Blackwood was unreadable, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, always watching, always calculating. And yet, there was something undeniably magnetic about him, something that made her pulse race in a way she wasn't sure she liked. "Your car or mine?" she asked, attempting to inject some humor into the moment. Jack smirked. "I'm afraid your car doesn't quite match the occasion." Emily scoffed. "And what occasion is that, exactly?" "An adventure." Before she could protest, Jack gestured toward the curb, where a sleek black Aston Martin idled, engine purring softly in the quiet of the night. The sight of it made Emily pause. She wasn't surprised, exactly. Of course Jack Blackwood drove something expensive, but seeing it in front of her made the situation feel more real. Jack opened the passenger door for her. "After you, Miss Carter." Emily hesitated. This was the moment where she could still walk away, still return to her predictable, ordinary life. But something in her refused to move in that direction. With a steadying breath, she slid into the seat. The leather was cool beneath her fingertips, the faint scent of something expensive, leather and cedar maybe lingering in the air. A second later, Jack slipped into the driver's seat, the door shutting with a soft click. "Nervous?" he asked, glancing at her as he started the car. Emily lifted her chin. "Should I be?" Jack chuckled, shifting the car into gear. "That depends." "On what?" "How much you trust me." Emily didn't respond. She wasn't sure she did trust him. But she was here anyway, wasn't she? With that unspoken thought lingering between them, Jack pulled away from the curb, the city lights reflecting off the hood as they disappeared into the night. And for the first time in a long time, Emily felt like she had no idea what was going to happen next. The city lights blurred as the car moved smoothly through the streets. Inside the darkened cabin, Emily could feel the tension thickening, an unspoken challenge lingering between her and Jack. She had agreed to this, agreed to step into his world for the night. But now, as the buildings grew farther apart and the streets became quieter, a question gnawed at her. What the hell am I doing? Jack sat beside her, his posture relaxed but his presence overpowering. He had barely said a word since they left the restaurant, but she could feel his eyes on her, watching, waiting. She exhaled slowly. Are you going to tell me where we're going? Jack smirked, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Does it matter? Emily clenched her jaw. It does when I don't know you. Jack turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable. And yet, you got into my car anyway. Her stomach tightened. He wasn't wrong. She had made a choice, a reckless, stupid, thrilling choice, and now she had to see where it led. Outside, the city lights faded as the car took a turn onto a secluded road lined with towering trees. Emily's pulse quickened. Jack. Her voice was steady, but she couldn't hide the sliver of unease creeping in. Where exactly are we going? Jack leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. Somewhere quiet, her fingers curled against her lap. That's not an answer. Jack's lips twitched. It's the only one I'm giving you. A cold knot formed in Emily's stomach, but at the same time, something else stirred. Something dark, something dangerous. She wasn't afraid of Jack. Not exactly, but she knew instinctively that he was the kind of man you didn't challenge lightly. If I wanted to leave right now, would you let me? For the first time, Jack hesitated. It was subtle, just a flicker of something in his expression. But she caught it. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. He tilted his head, studying her with something almost like amusement. Do you want to leave, Miss Carter? Emily's breath caught in her throat. That was the real question, wasn't it? And the terrifying thing was, she didn't know the answer. The car slowed as it turned onto a secluded, winding road. Tall trees stretched overhead, their shadows casting long, eerie patterns across the pavement. Emily shifted in her seat, her fingers pressing into the leather beneath her. The air inside the car felt heavier, thick with something unspoken, something dangerous. Jack hadn't taken his eyes off her. He sat impossibly still, one hand resting on his glass, the other draped lazily over his knee. Everything about him was composed, in control, calculated. Tell me something, Emily, he said, his voice smooth, deliberate. Why did you stay? She swallowed. What do you mean? Jack tilted his head slightly, watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. You could have walked away at any point tonight, but you didn't. Emily felt her breath hitch. He wasn't wrong. She had every opportunity to leave, to excuse herself at the restaurant, to refuse the ride, to demand the car turn around. But she hadn't, and they both knew it. She glanced out the window. The city was gone now, replaced by something quieter, isolated. A deep instinct clawed at her, telling her that she had stepped too far past the point of no return. I don't know, she admitted finally. Jack exhaled softly, almost like a laugh. Honest, I like that. The car came to a smooth stop in front of a massive estate. The structure was dark, imposing, set back against the trees as if it had been carved from the night itself. The driver stepped out first, moving with quiet precision to open Jack's door. Jack didn't move right away. Instead, he leaned in just slightly, close enough that Emily could feel the warmth of his presence. Last chance, Miss Carter. His voice was barely above a whisper. If you step out of this car, you step into my world. Emily's breath came shallow and uneven. The rational part of her screamed at her to turn back, to get out while she still could. But another part, the one that had been drawn to him from the moment he first spoke, refused to let her move. Slowly, deliberately, she reached for the door handle. Jack's eyes darkened with something unreadable. Approval? Satisfaction? Something else entirely? Emily stepped out of the car. The moment her feet touched the ground, she felt it. The shift. The silent understanding that nothing about this night or her life would be the same after this. Jack followed, closing the door behind him. The soft click of the lock echoed louder than it should have. He turned to her, his expression calm, controlled. Welcome to the game, Miss Carter. And then he led her inside. The doors of the estate shut behind her with a quiet thud, sealing Emily inside. The air smelled of aged wood and expensive whiskey, a stark contrast to the crisp night outside. The grand foyer stretched into the shadows, the glow of a single chandelier casting flickering patterns along the marble floor. It was beautiful and unsettling. Jack walked ahead of her, his steps unhurried, controlled. like a man who always knew exactly where he was going. Emily hesitated for only a second before following. "This place," she murmured, trailing her fingers along the dark wood of an antique table. "It doesn't feel lived in." Jack smirked but didn't turn around. "That's because it isn't." Her steps faltered. "Then why are we here?" He finally stopped at the base of a grand staircase, resting one hand on the polished banister. The shadows clung to him, stretching out like something alive. "Because I needed to see something," he said quietly. Emily frowned. "See what?" Jack exhaled, his expression unreadable. "If you'd follow me this far." Something in his voice sent a chill through her. "Why does that matter?" Jack took a slow step toward her. "Because I don't do chance encounters, Emily." His voice was steady, but his eyes burned with something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. "And you aren't just some woman who sat at the wrong table." Her stomach tightened. "What are you talking about?" Jack studied her for a long moment, as if deciding whether or not to say what came next. "You were supposed to be there tonight." Emily's pulse pounded in her ears. "What? Your friend, Sophie? She never made a reservation. That table was meant for you." The room suddenly felt smaller, colder. "That doesn't make any sense," Emily whispered, her throat tightening. Jack took another step closer, his voice calm but relentless. "Doesn't it? Think, Emily. Did Sophie ever actually tell you where you were meeting? Or did you just assume?" Emily's mind raced, grasping at memories that suddenly felt unreliable. She had been the one to text Sophie earlier. Sophie had just said, "Meet me tonight. I have a surprise." No location, no details. Her stomach twisted. This was planned? Her voice was barely a breath. Jack nodded. "In a way." Emily took a shaky step back. "By who?" Jack's gaze never wavered. "By me." The world tilted. "Why?" she whispered. Jack exhaled slowly, as if he had expected this reaction. "Because I needed to meet you, and I needed to know if you'd come this far willingly." Emily's breath hitched. A million questions tangled in her mind, but only one mattered. "Who are you really, Jack?" His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted. "The man who's been looking for you for a very long time." The room felt impossibly silent. Emily's heart thundered, and then Jack Blackwood smiled. "Now the real game begins."